As you read the legislation, he actually has the authority to move around some funds. Now, it's a separate question as to whether it's a good idea that he do that. Personally, I don't think it's a good idea because it continues, and this gets to the second part of your question, this trend that we've seen for really the last, well, since the 1970s, with the passage of the Modern Budget Control Act in 1974 and the War Powers Resolution in 1973. Both pieces of legislation were intended to rein in the power of the executive branch and re-empower Congress, but they did the exact opposite. Since then, Congress has systematically surrendered all of its primary authority under the Constitution, that is the power of the purse, to the executive branch, and all of its significant authority under the Constitution to conduct or to have a role in foreign policy to the executive branch. That is the fundamental distortion of our Constitution, is that Congress has gotten weak and the executive branch has gotten stronger and stronger. And that's a problem, because the framers deliberately designed Article 1, the legislative branch, to be the most powerful branch in our government, for good reason. We are most accountable to the people. You have a way of getting rid of me every 2 years. There's 535 of us that are elected in a mix of every 2 to 6 years. There's only one person in the executive branch that's elected. And while I may happen to agree more than disagree with what President Trump wants to do on border security right now, doing anything through executive order is impermanent. It can just be undone by the next administration, which gets to my final concern about going down the path of a national emergency. It sets a terrible precedent, right? So let's say the next president is someone with whom I vigorously disagree on pick your issue, right? Let's take your pick of whoever that person is, right? Now that person has a precedent of declaring a national emergency, let's say we do have a health crisis in this country. What if that next president said, we're going to declare a national emergency and I am declaring all employee-sponsored health insurance illegal because we're just going to provide single-payer health insurance? I would think that's a bad idea, and anytime you expand executive authority, you create the possibility for something like that to happen, which is why I disagree with the use of emergency authority. The final thing I'd say on it is it lets Congress off the hook, right? Here's what happened. The president came to Congress for funding for a wall and authorization. Congress said no, effectively no, but here's some money and you can do some other things. And then the president is now saying, well, that's enough, so I'm going to declare a national emergency and do it. So it makes Congress look weak, and it also allows the members of Congress who weren't actually willing to solve the problem to just point their finger at the executive branch and say, well, shame on them, right? When it's Congress, it should be stepping up and solving these problems, as difficult as they are to solve. So that's along with me saying a few things. One, I support border security. I do not support the declaration of a national emergency. And two, I am a vehement Article 1 how would I say this? Like an Article 1 champion. The fundamental thing we need to do to fix our republic right now is to restore power within the legislative branch of government relative to the executive branch. Otherwise, we're going to go further down this path of adjudicating everything through executive order. And I'm getting a lot of heat from my fellow conservatives right now because I pointed out the dangers of a national emergency. And to them I say, you guys were not happy when President Obama was doing everything through executive orders, so you have to be consistent. So personally, I believe in the idea that we do need to move from a family-based system to a merit-based system, because we should be able to say, okay, let's look at the needs of our economy, and right now we need CNAs. Right now we need people with a particular expertise in certain STEM fields. And it's hard to sort of toggle it up and down, but you could create sort of certain economic or national security categories where you would allow for a greater amount of visas or green cards or whatever, or things like that. But right now the system just isn't flexible enough to do it. In fact, we end up turning away a lot of our most talented people because we have an antiquated quota system. So for example, India produces a lot of engineers who are precisely the type of people you would want to come here, work in industries that are going to be critical as we compete with China, things like 5G, cloud computing, AI, and yet we make it almost impossible for people that come here, study at our best universities, to stay here and start a business here. Instead, we send them home to go compete against us, and we sort of lose all that human talent. Wouldn't an easier approach, I understand what you're trying to do, disincentivize sort of fossil fuel production or emission, right? And have some sort of, go ahead. Yeah.
Not hurt
the people that would presumably pay the cost of higher energy, right? So one easier way to do that would be just to take a look at the tax code and look at the multitude of ways in which fossil fuel producing companies exploit tax loopholes that we've given them through the years and eliminate that. And I think I think that would bring a lot of conservatives on board. While at the same time consider indexing the gas tax to inflation, which we haven't done since the mid-90s, which would then allow us to finance infrastructure investment. So to me, that's an easier first step. And I'll confess the second big hang-up I have on it so far, I see the logic of trying to pay the dividend back to consumers, right? I have no confidence that the federal government would act as an honest broker in that model, right? That when they had that giant windfall of resources, that indeed the money would stay going to consumers. And maybe I'm just more cynical, but that's one of my concerns right now.
What Wisconsin did to the tobacco, mass, I mean, so it's as soon as you got a pot, doesn't matter what party you're from,
and
it gets raided.
The biggest thing I always get to, or intellectual problem I have when we talk about ways we could reduce emissions in the United States, which is a noble goal that I support, is even if we somehow got down to zero emissions, we would still confront the China and India issue, right? Which are by far the biggest polluters. So the question, and as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about foreign policy, I find myself thinking about how we get at that. Well, one, I do think we need to win the race for next generation clean technology. And you maybe might disagree, but Bill Gates agrees with me that he agrees with me, like he knows who I am. I mean, nuclear micro-reactor technology is going to be a big part of that. The Chinese are investing heavily in it. It's important for national security because you have a lot of military bases that are on the grid right now, and they're vulnerable to attack. And if they had a micro-reactor, they could be off the grid. It's clean. There are risks. I'm not going to lie, but we have to figure it out one way or the other. And for solar to really realize its promise, we're going to need next-generation battery technology, which requires an investment in R&D. And so one thing we're looking at doing this year is through the National Defense Authorization Act, is there a way where we can increase the amount of federal research and development we're doing in this area, not just from a clean environment perspective, but from a national security perspective, because we don't want the Chinese Communist Party to dominate these technologies because they're going to reap an enormous windfall and they're going to reap the environmental benefits. And then I would say thirdly, if we could find a way to sell American natural gas to the Chinese and the Indians and wean them off their dependence on coal, that would be a geopolitical win and an environmental win at the same time. So I know you guys are focused on the carbon tax issue, but let's figure out, there's some other things that we may be able to work together on while you still try and convince me on the carbon tax.
And on the gas tax,
Yeah.
On the state level, our new governor is exploring this, and it's very unpopular, increasing the gas tax. So already at the state level, they're pulling back because it's not pulling well. And
well, listen, human beings, right? We want everything, but we don't want to have to pay for it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you want an investment in infrastructure? Okay, how are we going to pay for it? I mean, it's not a conservative approach to borrow the money or bond the money. So it's just, you got to make hard choices, right? Otherwise, we're not going to be able to have it. And so, unless we somehow magically create money out of nowhere. So, what other levers can we pull? Tolling, I view that as a much more unpopular option. Mm-hmm. Here's the reality that I think critics of the gas tax are right on one key area. As vehicles get more efficient, as electric vehicles gain more prominence, the gas tax is going to become increasingly useless. Not entirely, but you're not going to get as much money from the gas tax because people won't be using as much gas, right? So you have to transition to what's called a vehicle miles travel program, where there's a tax based on how many miles you're driving on the road. But that gets complicated too. We're not there yet because people have legitimate concerns about, the government tracking how many miles that you drive and knowing where you are at all times. So it's just a question of how you want to do it. An alternative proposal on carbon tax to the one that CCL has endorsed is the Curbelo bill, and I think it's now the Rooney bill, that would take money from a carbon tax and use that and it would get rid of the gas tax entirely, replace it with a carbon tax, and then use the revenue to invest in infrastructure. So it doesn't go back directly to the American citizens, it goes back to them in the form of better infrastructure, which only works if you could ensure that money was used for good infrastructure and not sort of bridges and trains to nowhere. Yeah.
I'll just say one thing.
Yeah.